The Trump administration told U.S. lawmakers that it lacks legal justification to strike Venezuela, but the officials did not rule out any potential future actions, according to U.S. media. The White House is increasing pressure on Venezuelan President Nicholas Maduro, amassing a military presence in the region and striking boats in the middle of the ocean.
The United States military strikes on so-called narco-terrorists off the Venezuelan coast have been increasing and are increasingly controversial. The U.S. president denies there are any plans for a direct strike.
There are reports that you are considering strikes within Venezuela. Is that true?
No.
That you made a decision on that?
No, it's not true.
But Venezuela's leader is not convinced.
Why are they afraid of me? If it's not me, it's the people who are standing up, fighting. Bolivarian and Chavista, masters of their own destiny, who will never be humiliated.
It's not just Venezuela. The second Trump administration has taken a much more violent approach to its Latin American neighbors. Cloaked in terms of stemming the flow of illegal immigrants and narcotics, the White House has inserted itself into the internal politics of Central and Latin America, breaking with Colombia after it elected a leftist government which opposes the military actions in the Caribbean and Pacific.
In both circumstances, there is disproportionate use of force, which is punished by international humanitarian law. We have done things differently.
And when it comes to Latin America's largest country, Brazil, the U.S. president took the unprecedented step of imposing 50% tariffs on the country over its judicial proceedings against former President Jair Bolsonaro, a personal ally convicted of attempting to stage a coup to stay in power after his 2022 election loss. He has, however, started negotiating with Brazil's current president, Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva.
I am convinced that, as I said before, I was optimistic. I'm optimistic about the possibility of advancing efforts to maintain a good relationship between the U.S. and Brazil.
A new United States National Defense Strategy document is expected to come out of the Pentagon in coming weeks. And reports suggest the Trump administration policy will outline a much more aggressive approach in what it calls its backyard.
To discuss the U.S. actions in Latin America, let's bring in our panel. Here in Washington, D.C., Michael Shifter is a senior fellow and former president of the Inter-American Dialogue. From Beijing, we're joined by Vijay Prashad. He is the executive director of Tricontinental. Aaron Matei is host of Pushback with Aaron Matei on the Grayzone. He joins us from New York City. And from Sao Paulo, Gustavo Ribeiro is editor-in-chief of the Brazilian Report. Welcome to all of you. Michael Shifter, we have been here before. The United States over the last 6 or 7 decades has often targeted countries in South and Central America. The list is very long, but what do you believe this is about? Is it about drugs or is it about something else?
It's hard to believe that it's actually about drugs, given the extent of the military deployment. If the administration was really interested in going after drugs, this is not what it would be doing. So it seems to be that there's another motivation there, and it could be to play to his domestic constituency to show that he's strong in the U.S. so-called U.S. backyard. It could be that there's trying to provoke panic and fear in Venezuela and the rest of Latin America to show who's boss, to just assert domination and power. But the only way to do that appeals to his domestic constituency is to frame it in terms of going after drugs and going after terrorism. So Maduro was called a narco-terrorist, and that is a way to handle it politically. But I think there's a lot of performance here. There's a lot of theater. Obviously, a lot of people have been killed, but has no legal justification, and I think absolutely no efficacy in terms of dealing with the serious drug problem.
Michael, it would seem that this is more than about an assertion of domination and power. The president was on a United States television network over the weekend. He was asked about Venezuela. This is what he said. Let's listen.
Are Maduro's days as president numbered?
I would say, yeah. I think so, yeah.
So, listening to his answer there, Michael, is this, in effect, Trump giving notice that the United States plans on overthrowing a sovereign government?
Well, I think you could interpret it that way, or you can interpret alternatively that he's saying that his days are numbered because Maduro is obviously very rattled. We know that from reports from Caracas, and that he thinks that this is going to set in motion a process where there's going to be a fracture within the armed forces, which is the main pillar of the Maduro regime, and that there'll be a change in government. That doesn't mean that the United States necessarily is going to undertake an operation directly to take out Maduro. That's not impossible, but I think the thinking might be that this is going to happen from inside the regime itself, and that some military officer will turn on Maduro. I think that's strikes me as a more plausible scenario that the U.S. has in mind than a direct strike.
Vijay, Prashad, President Trump claims that for every boat that is destroyed, 25,000 American lives are saved. Now, there are many publications that have already debunked that statement and pointed out that actually Venezuela plays a very small role in trafficking drugs, if at all, that reach the United States. Most of the drugs that come into the United States from outside come from Mexico or from Colombia. But what are your thoughts on what is going on right now?
Well, Anand, it's great to be with you. The first point is that the Department of Drugs, the Drug Enforcement Agency of the United States government, had a report out in May 2025. There's a very small paragraph where they mention Venezuela, but they acknowledge that there really isn't much drug trafficking from Venezuela to the United States. This is not my report. This is the Drug Enforcement Agency's report. So Mr. Trump needs to read the paperwork of his own government to be informed about what his own people are saying. There is no drug problem from Venezuela. The report suggests that there are other problems that he might want to check on. In my opinion, it's actually incorrect to say that Mr. Maduro's principal area of support is from the military. There's a very large section of the population that continues to be, driven by the Bolivarian process. The United States is conducting an illegal activity in the Caribbean. After all, there is no UN Security Council resolution under Chapter 7 that authorizes the U.S. to take military force. These are illegal actions. The first prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, Luis Moreno Ocampo, has already come out and said that the killing of these 62 plus people in the Caribbean in small boats without any judicial opportunity to defend themselves is a crime. So the United States once again is flagrantly violating the UN Charter, is going against international law, and in fact, in this case, is ignoring its own agencies. This is a blatant act of force. The United States trying to once again put the Monroe Doctrine on the table, and I think that's how we should see it. To do it any other way is merely decoration.
Aaron Maté, good to see you. Oh, Aaron, what do you make of this massive show of force in the Caribbean? I mean, the United States has deployed its largest aircraft carrier in that region right now.
It's the latest stage in a long-running war against Venezuela. And of course, this doesn't begin in Venezuela. The U.S. has been trying to destabilize and overthrow global South governments that are outside of its control, especially in Latin America, which, as Vijay mentioned, the U.S. sees as basically being its property under the Monroe Doctrine. In Cuba in 1960, a State Department cable advised that the U.S. Increase hunger and desperation inside Cuba because they recognized that the new government there, led by Fidel Castro, had popular support. Same thing with Chile when they tried to overthrow Allende in the 1970s. The directive was to make the economy scream, as the Nixon administration put it. So they tried that in Venezuela. There have been coup attempts, the first one against Hugo Chavez in the early 2000s. That didn't work. In Trump's first term, they tried to install a fake president, Juan Guaido. That didn't work. They've imposed these crippling sanctions that have really hurt Venezuela, have caused a massive wave of migration, as one of the architects of U.S. regime change policy, John Bolton, even admitted. And now they're escalating to this point, assassinating people in the high seas and sending massive U.S. military assets to try to intimidate the people of Venezuela, and I think try to make the government collapse from within. Hopefully, they're hoping, I think, that enough people in the Venezuelan government will turn on Maduro. But that hasn't happened because people don't like to have a larger hegemon trying to tell them how to run their government. And I think you're seeing that resistance continue in Venezuela today.
Right, Aaron, President Trump justifies these attacks on these boats by saying that they are bringing drugs into the United States. But many of those boats are really small. They do not have the capability of reaching the United States coast. There's been some criticism from President Trump's own party of what is going on. This is Senator Rand Paul. Let's listen to him.
They go against all of our tradition. You know, when you kill someone, you should know if you're not at war, not in a declared war, you really need to know someone's name at least. You have to accuse them of something. You have to present evidence. So all of these people have been blown up without us knowing their name, without any evidence of a crime. But we know from Coast Guard statistics that about 25% of the time the Coast Guard boards a ship, there are no drugs. So if our policy now is to blow up every ship we suspect or accuse of drug running, that would be a bizarre world in which 25% of the people might be innocent.
Aaron, are we in reality looking at another one of those weapons of mass destruction moments, setting up a country for attack, except it's not weapons of mass destruction this time, it's drugs?
Yes, and ironically, it comes from a President Trump who capitalized on the very real fatigue that exists in the U.S. public with these Iraq WMD type deceptions that get the U.S. entangled in foreign regime change wars. Trump is supposed to be the president who is going to end all that, but he's just continuing that exact same legacy, this time in Venezuela. And he's very clear as to why. In the same way that the Iraq invasion, a lot of that had to do with controlling Iraq's oil reserves. Trump has said, and many top regime change supporters openly say, that Venezuela has oil. In fact, some of the largest oil reserves in the world, and also critical minerals that the U.S. wants to take control of. That's what all of this is about. And so the pretext of drug trafficking can just be dismissed as, yes, another Iraq WMD level hoax.
Gustavo Ribeiro, speaking of Trump's statements on Venezuela, he's also made claims during his campaign and also as president that Venezuela was sending people to the United States, emptying their prisons, emptying their mental hospitals, and that these people were crossing the border into the United States. Of course, there's no evidence of that. Nobody's shown any evidence of that. Is this just fear-mongering? And how is this seen across the broader continent?
Well, U.S. prosecutors have indicted Maduro and members of his administration a few years ago with arguments that have been described by experts as this Hollywood version of how the Maduro administration is run and their ties to organized crime and to criminal activity. Of course, there are credible reports that the armed forces, many people in the high echelons of the armed forces are allowed to dive into the drug trafficking trade, but it's much a muddier version than what the U.S. is trying to sell. In terms of how Latin Americans feel about it, is interesting because a few opinion polls have consistently shown in recent months that there is a lot of support in the region for U.S. intervention in Venezuela. Now, it does not mean by any means that Latin America's welcome is just this sort of blanket welcoming of U.S. intervention. It's more about how Latin Americans and South Americans feel about the Maduro regime rather than welcoming more interference from the U.S. Because that wave of migration that many countries saw after the economic collapse of Venezuela has led to several problems in many countries like Colombia, like northern Brazil, has sparked a lot of questions about immigration and border control. And so like many Brazilians, a majority of Brazilians and a majority of Colombians support intervention against Maduro, but I don't think they would support intervention from the U.S. in their own countries. So I think it's more nuanced than the headlines suggest.
Yeah, it certainly is nuanced. I mean, how would one explain, Gustavo, the fact that there are people in Brazil, there are people in Colombia who support, as you say, U.S. intervention in Venezuela when their countries themselves are being targeted by Trump?
Well, the thing is, Venezuela has become this sort of cautionary tale in the region, and it has been instrumentalized by the right in many countries, and that's certainly the case in Brazil. When you're criticizing the other side's politics, usually the argument is they are going to turn us into Venezuela. So there is a lot of, it has become a very divisive topic of discussion in Latin American politics, and there is not much love lost for Maduro, especially in countries that saw an inflow of Venezuelan migrants this past few years.
Michael Shifter, what is your view on broader U.S. policy, broader Trump policy in Latin America? I mean, you have said that the policy that is being used by this current administration is aggressive but erratic. Those were the words that you used. So what is the broader goal, if there is a goal at all?
I think there's no strategy or plan for Latin America. I think that we shouldn't be give Trump and his administration too much credit, that think that there's really some scheming and some thought out plan. I see the actions, there's clearly a lot of actions related to Latin America, probably more than we've seen in a long time. And, you know, if you look at Mexico, Colombia, Panama, I mean, all over, but I don't think there's any thought that's given to really strategic objectives that the Trump administration has. I think it's, you know, it's trying to project power. It's trying to show that it's tough. It's trying to sow some fear in the region. And obviously there have been punitive measures. There have been tariffs and there have been threats and you know, in Brazil and then in Colombia now. A lot of it is personalistic. A lot of it goes back to Trump's political agenda. But the other thing I'd really underscore is that a lot of it also has to do with his domestic support. And we're at a moment now where a lot of his, you know, he's losing a lot of support and popularity. We just had elections in the United States. And I think we should not completely separate what he's going to be doing in Latin America to what's happened to his eroding support in the United States. There's something called wag the dog, that you distract and you show that you're tough and you try to sort of energize your political base because you're in political trouble. And I think he's in political trouble. You know, there are midterm elections a year from now. And I would really just point to, you know, Latin American policy has always had a very high salience of U.S. domestic politics. And I think we should see that as connected. But I don't think there's any strategy. I don't think there's any plan. And I think it's reactive. And I think it has to do with Trump's impulses and his whims. Yeah. And doesn't really add up to something very much.
Michael, very briefly, if Trump is displaying this show of force for domestic political reasons, which particular part of the political spectrum is he concerned about?
Well, I think he's trying to show support for his base. As was mentioned before, you know, he's not going to commit troops because he is somebody who was, you know, very opposed to the Iraq War and forever wars and foreign entanglements. But that's why he's framed this in Venezuela, what he's doing in terms of drugs and in terms of terrorism. Not because he wants to solve the problem. I don't think he cares about the problem, but because it has some appeal and resonance among the people that, you know, brought him to the presidency twice. And he wants to keep those people. The last thing he wants to do is lose them. So I think if the economy is going bad in the United States, which it is, and this high inflation and unemployment is increasing, I think that I think it makes sense that he would resort to that to try to keep that base very strong for him. I think that's very important for him. And he can use Latin America to sort of play around. That's his playground.
Vijay, when we look at this buildup of military forces in the Caribbean, you know, Trump would appear to be threatening a conventional war to overthrow Maduro. But do you think, getting back to Gustavo's point earlier on, that there is an element of support, a level of support among other Latin American countries for U.S. intervention in Venezuela?
Well, Anand, certainly there will be support from people like Javier Milei and the far right across Latin America because they have made this an issue. But I think there's a gross underestimation of the global situation, when we understand this particular assault on Venezuela, this has nothing to do with drugs, okay? There's no evidence that it has anything to do with drugs. We should take that off the table. This has nothing to do with Nicolas Maduro. Mr. Trump doesn't have a problem with Mr. Maduro. It could be that that Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, understands full well that if the United States overthrows the government in Venezuela, then his own personal pet project of overthrowing the Cuban Revolution will come closer to reality. Could be, but I don't think that's what's going on. Let's remember that it was as recent as January of this year that Mr. Trump sent his personal envoy, Richard Grenell, to Caracas, where he negotiated with the Maduro government for the release of 6 U.S. People who were being held there. Some of them had attempted an invasion, minor invasion of Venezuela. Mr. Grenell, who came on the personal say-so of Donald Trump, was just there some months ago, 10 months ago. They successfully conducted a deal. The process of the Barbados process, went forward. They put the election behind them, and so on. This is very little to do with drugs or anything. This has to do with Russia. When in January, Mr. Trump was convinced that he could do a deal with Russia, it was very important to settle the Venezuela file, because Venezuela has developed very close relationship with Russia. Now with the relationship with Russia sort of teetering, I think Mr. Trump is trying to put pressure on the Kremlin by squeezing Venezuela. I think this is what's happening here. This is really about the Trump-Putin relationship. It has very little to do with Maduro.
Aaron Mate, of course, all of this, poses questions about what is going on inside the Trump administration. As Michael pointed out, this was a president who was initially opposed to the invasion of Iraq. He's also come in to say that he's not a war president. He wants to resolve wars. He wants to bring peace to most parts of the world. But if we look at his track record in the past 10 months since he's been in office in this second term, he's been a partner with Israel in what a UN panel has called a genocide in Gaza. He's bombed Iran, he's bombed Yemen, among other countries, and now we see this military buildup in the Caribbean as well. Would it be fair to say right now, Aaron, that the military hawks are now in the ascendancy in this administration? I mean, we just heard Vijay mentioned Marco Rubio. Is he one of them, one of the prime drivers of this policy?
Oh, absolutely. Rubio has been determined to overthrow the government of Cuba for a long time. And to do that, he wants to bring about regime change in Venezuela, which is a critical ally. And to do that, they've undertaken policies that have really damaged Venezuela. These sanctions, everyone now understands, have crippled Venezuela's economy. And as I mentioned earlier, have caused migration. The very same migrants that Donald Trump demonizes when he runs for office were in large part created by him through his policies in countries like Venezuela. That's what happens when you impose sanctions that are designed to throttle an economy and cut it off from the global financial system. You're going to cause people to flee the ensuing devastation that results. Marco Rubio has been a key architect of that. People like Richard Grenell, who, as Vijay mentioned, went to Venezuela to negotiate a prisoner exchange. He's been sidelined in the administration. He lost that battle, from what I understand, for now. And absolutely, people like Marco Rubio are ascendant. These are the same people who, in Trump's first term, they literally stole Venezuela's oil company, Citgo, its U.S. subsidiary, was stolen from Venezuela through the fake government that they tried to install with Juan Guaido. They also stole Venezuela's gold reserves in a bank in the UK. I mean, all this is intended to deprive Venezuela of its own resources, to cause enough desperation so the government collapses. So the government collapses, and that's the policy we're still seeing today.
Gustavo, despite the problems that President Trump has with Venezuela, he's had issues with Brazil and most recently with Colombia as well. He does have one firm ally in Latin America. Of course, that is Argentina. Washington recently granted Argentina a $20 billion loan, a bailout loan, basically, right before the midterm elections in that country. And that loan helped the president, Milei, to garner votes. Here is President Trump talking about President Milei just before that election. Let's listen.
And he may win and he may not win, but I think he's going to win. And if he wins, we're staying with him. And if he doesn't win, we're gone.
So, Gustavo, how important is Argentina and President Milei in Trump's Latin America policy?
Yeah, just before I answer, I would like to talk a little bit about a few points that were raised by my fellow panelist. Michael was talking about the U.S. politics dynamic and how it affects how Trump views Latin America. And it's interesting because the Latino population in the U.S. has veered more Republican, and this population tends to be more hawkish in terms of the policy towards the region. So that is also an interesting dynamic to talk about. And here in Latin America, we have complained for decades that U.S. foreign policy neglected the region for many years. Now we're seeing more attention, so it's be careful with what you wish for. Talking about Argentina, yes, Argentina is one of the biggest economies in the region, and it allows Trump to have one of those laboratory for his MAGA politics. But I would like to say that sometimes we tend to overblown the importance of the influence of the U.S. in some local dynamics. I think we should not forget that the Peronist movement still is heavily associated with the inflation crisis that Argentina has saw. And even if artificially, Milei has lowered the inflation rate, and that has a lot of electoral appeal with the Argentine constituents.
Okay, and that is where we have to leave it. Thank you to all of you for being with us. That is it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington.